At 3 in the morning, a mother heard a whine from her daughter's bedroom. She found the door closed, which was wrong, because in that house, it was never closed, pushed it open partway, saw nothing, and went back to bed. By 6:30, she would know that somewhere in that gap of darkness, her 8-year-old daughter had been taken from a bedroom 2 doors down from where the man responsible was already asleep in his own bed. He would go on living there for the next 18 years. He would wave at her family. He would tell his own wife, years later, that the case upset him because it happened so close to his house. It had happened much closer than that. This is Crime Narrator. New here? Stick around. We dig into cases most channels won't touch until they're already solved. And this one wasn't solved for 18 years. Her name was Kirsten Renee Hatfield. She was born on February 12, 1989, and in May of 1997, she was 8 years old. A second grader at Traub Elementary School in Midwest City, Oklahoma. 4 feet 2 inches tall, 55 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes, a small mole on the bridge of her nose near her left eye. She had a stutter that softened when she was comfortable and disappeared almost entirely around people she trusted. She was left-handed. The people who loved her called her Kurdle Burdle, the kind of nickname that only makes sense inside a family that carries an entire childhood folded up inside 3 syllables. She shared a bedroom with her 3-year-old sister, Faith. That night, she was wearing an oversized white t-shirt, a hand-me-down printed with the words Bud Bowl across the front, worn soft from years of washing. It would matter later, not the shirt itself, but the fact that a detail this small, this human, is what an entire community would use to keep looking for a little girl for the next 2 decades. May 13th, 1997, was an ordinary Tuesday in a house on Jet Drive. Kirsten's mother, Shannon, was raising 2 girls largely on her own, working, stretching money, doing what a lot of young mothers in that neighborhood were doing that year. Dinner, television, bath time for 2 girls who probably fought over whose turn it was to go first. The slow wind down of a house getting ready for bed. The kind of evening that happens so many times in a childhood that no single one of them is ever supposed to be the one anybody remembers. At 11:30 that night, Shannon tucked both girls in. Kirsten and Faith side by side, the hallway light spilling in through the door the way it always did. A small buffer of light against the dark, because that's how the girls liked it, and it had never once failed them. Shannon went to bed herself not long after. At around 3 in the morning, she woke to a whine from the girls' room. She assumed it was Faith. 3-year-olds talk in their sleep, cry out at nothing, settle back down without ever fully waking. She got up anyway. She found the door closed. She pushed it open partway, saw nothing that alarmed her, and went back to bed. That single decision, to check and not go further, would become one of the great unbearable what-ifs of this case, turned over for the rest of her life, like a stone she kept hoping had something written on the other side. Between 6 and 6:30 that morning, Shannon went to properly wake the girls. Faith was there, undisturbed. Kirsten's bed was empty. What followed was the sound every parent dreads making. A mother, panicked, calling 911, saying words that don't feel real coming out of your own mouth. My daughter, she's 8. She's missing. She's never done this before. Police arrived within the hour, and the case stopped being a disappearance and became something else entirely. The bedroom window, just above where Kirsten slept, was found unlocked and cracked open. On the sill, small spots of blood. In the backyard, more blood, on the 6-foot wooden fence separating the property from the alley behind it. And near that fence, investigators recovered torn, stained clothing belonging to Kirsten, lying in the yard she had played in 100 times. There was no crime scene beyond the window and the yard, no trail, no neighbor who heard a scream, no car, no sound, loud enough to wake a house full of sleeping people just feet away. Whoever had done this had done it in a silence that told investigators something chilling on its own. This wasn't chaos. This was control. Blood testing determined the blood on the sill, and the fence wasn't Kirsten's. It belonged to a man. That much 1990s DNA technology could tell them. A name was another matter entirely. They had a profile and no way to read it further. It was a locked door with no key in sight. Here is what the Midwest City Police Department did not know in those first frantic days. The key already existed. It just didn't exist yet in a form anyone could use. That evidence would sit in storage, untouched by the technology that could finally read it for 18 years. What happened next in Midwest City is the part people forget about cold cases. The part before they go cold, when an entire community still believes, correctly, that speed matters, that every hour counts. The Heidi Search Center flew volunteers in from Texas within days. A command post went up at Traub Elementary, Kirsten's own school, the place where she'd been sitting at a desk 2 days earlier, now a staging ground for the search for her. Search parties combed Lake Stanley Draper. They combed the Jones area outside the city. Flyers went up with her description: 4 feet tall, 55 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen in a white t-shirt with lettering across the front. Investigators pulled surveillance tape from a convenience store near the neighborhood, and for a moment, they thought they had something real. A man on camera asking the clerk how to find Jet Drive, described afterward as a black man, roughly 6'2", 230 pounds, wearing a blue and white striped shirt and a matching cap. Officers canvassed the area with that description for days, showing it to anyone who might recognize him. They wanted very badly to find him. They never did. To this day, nobody knows who he was, or whether he had anything to do with what happened to Kirsten. He is one of this case's open wounds, a face on a grainy tape that simply walked out of the record. A few days later, a bag of children's clothing turned up on the other side of Oklahoma City. Investigators brought it straight to Shannon. It wasn't Kirsten's. Another door opened and shut in the same afternoon. By early June, with no trace of Kirsten found, the searches were reorganized rather than abandoned, coordinated now directly through the Midwest City Police Department, still radiating out from that same command post at Traub Elementary. Shannon thanked the volunteers publicly, telling reporters it showed a kind of community spirit she hadn't expected to see, even in the middle of the worst thing that had ever happened to her family. But gratitude wasn't the same as answers, and the answers weren't coming. By July, the ground searches were called off, not because anyone had given up, but because the searchable ground had run out. "I am tired, I am beat, but I am not giving up," Shannon told reporters that summer. It would become close to her mantra for the next 2 decades. Investigators turned inward next, toward the people closest to Kirsten. The working theory was that a stranger couldn't have carried an 8-year-old out a window and over a 6-foot fence without noise, that this kind of quiet control suggested someone she knew. Several people close to the family took polygraphs. More than one came back failed or inconclusive, the kind of result that raises an eyebrow and proves nothing in court. Shannon herself was open, publicly and painfully, about her own struggles at the time, including drug use in her social circle, and said if her choices had made her daughter more vulnerable, she would carry that. "I certainly wasn't a perfect mother," she said. "Your kids are vulnerable to your friends." None of it led anywhere solid enough to charge a single person. Chief Brandon Klabes, who would still be leading that department nearly 2 decades later, called it early on one of those cases you carry with you, the kind you want solved before you retire, not after. That sentiment didn't fade. It sat in a filing cabinet and in the backs of several detectives' minds for the better part of 2 decades, while the Hatfield family tried, in whatever way a family can, to keep living with one bedroom permanently, unbearably unresolved. Shannon would eventually remarry a man named Chris Hazen 2 years after Kirsten disappeared, and life, in the only way it knows how, kept moving forward around a wound that never closed. Those 18 years were not silence. Anniversaries came and went, and each one, Shannon spoke to whichever reporter would still listen. Because a case that stays in the news is a case that stays open in people's minds, and a case that stays open in people's minds is a case somebody might still solve. There were no new leads worth chasing for most of that time. There was only the slow, grinding discipline of refusing to let a missing 8-year-old become a story people used to know. In 2014, a new detective was assigned to the file, not because of a fresh tip, not because of a deathbed confession, but because somebody finally sat down and asked a simple, overdue question. Did we actually test everything we collected? The answer was no. By the time anyone thought to ask that question, Kirsten would have turned 26 years old that year had she lived. 18 birthdays had passed with no candles, no cake, nothing but a case file that hadn't moved. Sitting in evidence since 1997 were items that had never been sent for forensic testing at all. Cigarette butts, a beer bottle, a bucket, collected in the initial sweep and then simply filed away. And the blood that had been tested back then had only been read as far as 1990s technology allowed. A profile, an unknown male, nothing more. The head of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation would later put it simply: as technology advances, labs can conduct testing far more sensitive than anything available when this evidence was first collected. By 2015, that technology had caught up. Investigators resubmitted the blood samples to OSBI for a new round of analysis, one capable of extracting a full, usable profile from material nearly 2 decades old, from stains that had faded to almost nothing on paper, evidence bags that had sat, sealed, since before some of the lab technicians working the case were even born. They ran it through the national database. No match. So they went back to basics. The roughly 10 men who'd been questioned in 1997 asked again, 18 years later, for a voluntary DNA sample. Most cooperated. One of them was a 56-year-old named Anthony Joseph Palma, who had been living at 1104 Jet Drive this entire time, 2 doors down from where Kirsten disappeared, and still there. He gave the sample willingly. He told investigators he'd been in bed that night, that he woke around 2 in the morning because a dog was barking in his backyard, that he let the dog in and went back to sleep. He said he had nothing to do with what happened to the girl down the street. When investigators spoke to his wife, a woman he'd married 2 years after Kirsten vanished, the same year as it happened that Shannon remarried too, she told them something small that would only make sense in hindsight, that Tony still got upset every year when the case came up in the news, because it had happened so close to his house. The sample came back a match, the blood on the windowsill, the blood on her recovered clothing. Both profiles, run against Palma's DNA, returned odds of 1 in 293 sextillion that the blood belonged to anyone else on Earth. Detective Daryl Miller, who had rebuilt this case from a box of untested evidence, put it plainly in the warrant request that sent officers to Palma's door. There had been no verified sighting of Kirsten since May of 1997, so it could be concluded she'd been killed shortly after her abduction. He went further. Palma's decision to stay in that house for 18 unbroken years wasn't neighborhood loyalty. It was, in his judgment, a way of staying close to whatever remained of the evidence, or the girl herself. Anthony Joseph Palma was arrested on October 12, 2015, and charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. The murder charge filed without a body, because investigators believed the 18 years of silence spoke for itself. Cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating sonar, and search teams combed his property afterward, inch by inch, backyard and shed. They found nothing. In the weeks after his arrest, Palma survived a self-harm attempt in his cell and was immediately placed on suicide watch. When investigators sat him down for formal questioning, he stuck to the same story he'd given at the door. He'd been asleep, a dog had woken him, he'd let it back in and gone back to bed. He denied ever setting foot in the Hatfields' yard. He denied knowing the family beyond passing familiarity. He would keep denying it, in one form or another, for the rest of his life. Through the interrogation room, through pre-trial hearings, through the trial itself, never once offering an explanation for why his blood was on that windowsill that the physical evidence could support. And investigators began digging into who Anthony Palma actually was, underneath 30-some years of being nothing more than a familiar face on a quiet street. What they found was not a man with no history. In 1979 or 1980, years before Kirsten was born, Palma had entered a home through a bedroom window at night, his girlfriend's home, and, according to accounts brought forward, targeted her 8-year-old sister. He was investigated. He was never charged. There wasn't enough evidence. In 1982, he was convicted of breaking into a woman's home and physically attacking her, a conviction that sent him to jail for just over a year. And in 1998, 1 year after Kirsten disappeared, a 17-year-old who had been living with him came forward and accused him of incapacitating her. Again, no charges followed. 3 separate incidents, 3 separate decades, 3 separate times, the system came close to Anthony Palma and didn't close the door on him. His trial began in October of 2017 in an Oklahoma County courtroom before Judge Glenn Jones. Prosecutors had named 20 potential witnesses, including Shannon herself, and a woman who would describe Palma as a family friend. They were permitted to introduce testimony from women describing those earlier incidents, not as proof of what happened to Kirsten, but as a pattern the jury was entitled to weigh. One woman, describing an incident from the early 1980s when she was 7 years old, broke down on the stand and told the court she came forward because she wanted them to know this wasn't the first time. Another described the night in 1998, waking up disoriented, believing she'd been drugged, in circumstances she said she still didn't fully understand decades later. A third woman told the jury about an assault years earlier that she believed would have gone further had she not been able to get away. Taken together, the 3 accounts spanned close to 20 years, and the prosecution's point was simple. This was not a single lapse in an otherwise blameless life. A childhood friend of Kirsten's testified that Palma used to watch her and Kirsten while they played outside. She said simply that he gave her the creeps. An OSBI forensic analyst walked the jury through the DNA findings, tying both the windowsill and the underwear back to Palma alone. Palma's own attorneys, Catherine Hammerstein and Thomas Hurley, argued the earlier allegations had nothing to do with Kirsten, called the investigation far-flung, and urged the jury to question evidence that had sat in storage for 18 years. It was a reasonable argument. It didn't work. The jury deliberated a little over an hour and returned a guilty verdict on first-degree murder. The original kidnapping charge, filed alongside the murder count back in 2015, had already been dismissed as a procedural matter before trial, folded into the larger case against him. Palma was sentenced to life without parole, formally entered on November 27, 2017. 20 years, almost to the month, after Kirsten went missing from a bedroom 2 doors from where he'd been sleeping the entire time. Outside the courthouse, Shannon said, "We are just floored by this miracle, and we are so thankful. It puts our hope back into the criminal justice system." Assistant District Attorney Scott Rowland put into words what everyone in that courtroom already understood, that a conviction wasn't the same thing as an ending. "We'll continue looking for her," he said, "until we find her remains, or until this man's heart softens enough that he sees fit to let us recover Kirsten's remains." It was, by any legal measure, the end of the case. But Kirsten's body had never been found, not in Palma's yard, not anywhere 18 years of searching had reached. And now the one man who almost certainly knew where she was had gone silent behind bars. Chief Clabe said publicly he hoped Palma might someday find, in his words, some inkling of a conscience. He never got the chance to choose, or someone made sure he wouldn't. 13 months into his sentence, on the night of January 11, 2019, corrections officers at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister found Palma unresponsive in his cell during a routine check, on the floor, covered with a blanket. His cellmate, a man already serving multiple life sentences after pleading guilty to 3 separate murders years earlier, with a prison record that included repeated infractions and more than a dozen confiscated contraband cell phones, was restrained and taken into custody. The medical examiner later ruled his death a homicide caused by physical assault and asphyxiation at the hands of his cellmate. Prison officials said Palma had never expressed concern about being housed with him. There had been no warning, no request to be moved, nothing in the record that suggested either man saw it coming. One attorney familiar with cases like his would later put it bluntly: "Inside a prison, a man convicted of killing a child isn't hidden. He's a target." Chief Clabes told reporters some people would say Palma had met his justice, but that, from an investigative standpoint, his death wasn't a victory. It was a door closing. "We may never have closure," he said, "because we wanted to find her body and bring her home." Shannon said she wouldn't celebrate his death. She had come to a place of forgiveness years before his arrest, extended toward a nameless, faceless abductor long before she knew the name Anthony Palma. Forgiveness that had carried her through the arrest and the trial. Whether it could carry her through this, the permanent loss of the one man who might have told her where her daughter was was something she said she was still finding out. 2 years after his death, on what would have been Kirsten's 30th birthday, Shannon told reporters she was still searching for answers. She asked investigators to search a lake where Palma had once worked, in case there was anything there connected to her daughter. And she said plainly that she worried his death would give the world permission to stop looking, that people would hear, "He's dead," and mistake it for, "She's found." There was no confession, there was no map, there was only a family waiting for an answer that a dead man had taken with him, and a case that remains to this day officially solved and personally, permanently unfinished. She should be 37 years old today. She was 8, left-handed, a girl who called herself Kurdle Burdle and shared a room with her little sister without complaint. She trusted a door left open a crack because the rule had never once failed her until the one night it did. She should have graduated high school and maybe college. She should have had birthdays that weren't marked by press conferences and grim anniversaries. She should have gotten to decide, herself, the kind of person Kurdle Burdle grew up to be. She never got the chance. And the man who took it from her took the rest of the answer with him to his own grave, less than 2 years after a jury looked at the evidence and said, unanimously, that they knew exactly who he was. This case doesn't end with a name and a verdict the way these stories usually do. It ends with a mother who spent more of her life searching than not searching, still asking, still hoping a lake somewhere holds the last piece of an answer that started with a whine in the dark 29 years ago, and still hasn't finished. What makes this one different from so many others isn't the crime itself. It's the 18 years of ordinary proximity that followed it. Palma didn't flee. He didn't change his name or leave the state. He mowed his lawn 2 doors down from a family who spent every one of those years wondering if the person responsible for their daughter's disappearance was someone they'd see at the grocery store. He was. For 18 years, he was. That's the part of this case worth sitting with. Not as fear, but as attention. Evidence doesn't expire just because technology hasn't caught up to it yet. A case going cold doesn't mean a case is over. And the person who seems the least likely, the most familiar, the most woven into the fabric of an ordinary street, is sometimes exactly who the evidence has been pointing to the entire time. Waiting, quite literally, for someone to look again. Kirsten Hatfield is still missing tonight. In or around a city that searched for her for 18 years, and then kept searching for 6 more, in a case that a jury closed and a family never could. If this case stayed with you, hit like, subscribe, and tell us which moment landed hardest for you. We'll see you in the next one. No case stays cold forever.